So Kathleen, if you want to introduce yourself, and then now it's your show. I'm out of it. Please.
Again, I want to continue my thank you for having all of us speak about mediation in our countries. I've heard some interesting stories and concepts of mediations from around the world and the concept of mediation. Just so grateful to be here. And for myself, I'm not training and I'm not mediating, and I'm talking about mediation, which I hardly ever get a chance to do. So I'm really grateful for this time. When you look at the United States and how mediation began in our culture, of course, we came from England, and we came to a land that was already occupied by Native Americans who already had their own system of justice. And we went through our country and we destroyed all of that, unfortunately. And all those beautiful practices that were in place with, via the Native Americans were just destroyed and lost. Back around in the 70s, the United States started to look at restorative practices and restorative justice, which was pulling from the Native Americans. And what we're really talking about is we're talking about harm. When harm is done to someone, what do we do? What do we do with that harm? In our country, in the United States, we separate people that do harm from the rest of society. We put them in jail, we put them in prison, depending how long for what they've done. Whereas the Native Americans, the tribe, I'll speak about the Navajo tribe, they restored back the individual that caused harm with the community. And as Jillian has she's done these practices in her high school in Flushing's, New York City, a small international high school, and there's a restoration process with restorative justice. So in the state of Massachusetts started looking at restorative justice back in the 70s. And we had, President Carter, and we had a professor from Harvard, and then we had a US attorney that basically said, our courts are overrun, similar to India, the country that you're from, country that many people love, and our courts are overrun in the United States, and we need to have something different. So these three minds started the mediation process in the United States. And they basically said, we need a neighborhood center where people can just come sit down at the table and talk to each other instead of the formality of court. So they erected 3 justice centers. One was in Atlanta, which is still existing. There was another one in Kansas City, and there was one in LA, where Jillian and I are now, in the city of LA. And these 3 justice centers were the concept of just come here instead of going to court, sit down at the table and talk about what's going on. So with that concept in place, we started this mediation concept, and every state took on their own statutes of, the Mediation Act. And Massachusetts basically took on that responsibility of putting statutes in place back in like 1993 and 1997, and every state's different. I think Lisa was talking about Ohio a couple of days ago. I watched her show, and I think they started theirs in 2005, but every state decided to have a mediation process. So now in the United States, most counties have a mediation center that's now connected with the courts. So we have 2 kinds of mediators in the United States. Generally speaking, we have court-approved mediators, and we have private practice mediators. I've had the privilege and excitement of doing both. I started in court, and then when I thought that I was good at what I was doing, I became a mediator in private practice as well. So I've done both for several years. And that's how the concept is spread thus far. And then in addition, law students, some of the law schools decided we can have a mediation clinic in our law school, not just an arbitration or just not a ADR clinic, but we're going to do a mediation clinic in some of the law schools. One was Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. And also when I went to judge tournament, I'm a mediation judge as well. Up in the Osgood Law School in Toronto, Canada, I walked into the law school and there was a mediation clinic on the left-hand side. And it was amazing. And these law students are mediating our cases connected with the courts via their law school experience. So that's what the United States has done generally with mediation, and that's where we are. And the concept of mediation simply is simply just having a conversation at the table. So as a mediator in the United States, that's what I try to keep in play, whether I'm mediating via Zoom in court or I'm mediating via Zoom or in person in my private practice. And we have these concepts that we promise in the beginning of the mediation. We have these 5 concepts, varies according to different states. In Massachusetts, where I first trained, and Atlanta in the Original Justice Center, one of them where I first trained as well. The concepts, of course, the common mediation is voluntary, and mediation is also something, whereas I, as your mediator, will be a neutral third party. Mediation is voluntary for everyone, including the mediator. Then we add a couple more concepts. We have the concept of mediation is about self-determination, where because of the mediator being the neutral third party, everyone gets to make their own decisions at the table. And then in states like Massachusetts, you see another one that talks about mediation is also about informed consent, where you're informed about all the knowledge, all the information about the case on the table, which gives you the ability to give consent to these agreements that you're deciding on the mediation table. So you're fully apprised. And you also have, of course, the ability to get in contact with counsel or go down with pause the mediation because of the informed consent. You can go down to the legal clinic and get some more information, or maybe you need to call someone for a decision, a party at the table. So we have those. Over in Washington State, where I work for a mediation center that does court cases, they also have good faith. So they're taking the legal term good faith and they're applying it to the mediation table. So we have these beautiful principles that we promise people at the beginning of the mediation process. And then we have a process that people go through at the mediation table. We start together in joint session with the mediator's opening. And then you're going to have your opportunity to open as well with your thoughts about the discussion. And then we're going to set an agenda and what's important to you. And then there's the order of the agenda. What's your top 3? What do you want to discuss first, second, and third? And then there is getting into the actual agreement writing. And with the agreement writing, oftentimes you'll see a lot of mediators use a rough draft agreement first. It's not as threatening as, a wordsmithing a full agreement. And then we go into the wordsmithing of the full agreement. So this is basically the concept of mediation. And when you talk about the culture of mediation, what's most important to me is actually the culture of those parties at the table. What has been their culture? How have they been handling conflict? So we've got all these cultures within cultures in the United States. We're a melting pot. And so it's interesting, what do we consider to be cultural? And how does that impact people at the mediation table? I don't look so much at that type of culture as far as our melting pot culture. What's important to me as a mediator is the culture of conflict in that workplace, the culture of conflict in that family, the culture of conflict, in a divorce. It's all about division and separation. No more adding to our lives. Now we're dividing everything up and we're separating. What does that culture of conflict look like at the mediation table? So as a mediator, that's what I pay the most attention to. And that's why at my mediation table, as I like to say, I want to make sure it's all embracing. So as a private practice mediator and a court practice mediator, I want to make sure that everyone's narrative is on the table. It's very important to me. People have narratives. They have narratives with their words. And I consider a narrative a life force, like breathing, like blood flow is a life force. They have narrative with their words. Then we have the narrative of body language that everyone always talks about. And the research says you pay attention to the body language if it disagrees with the words. That's what the real research says back in the day. And that's very important for mediators to understand. We've got somebody saying this, but they're doing this with their body. That needs to be clarified. And the last narrative that I consider on the mediation table is the narrative of the emotions, which oftentimes are hidden. I call it the underbelly of a person. And those emotions can get tapped into. And one of the reasons that the emotions get tapped into is because We promise all this safety, all these beautiful principles at the mediation table. So people get relaxed and they start to trust the process, and they start to trust what, you know, they're seeing and hearing in front of them. And so these emotions come flying up from inside them, deep inside them. And as a mediator that trains, I'm just like, it's one more thing to clarify. It's okay, we can have these emotions at the table, but they also deserve the honor of being clarified, just like the words are clarified, just like the body language may be clarified. Now we want to clarify the emotions. And when we have strong emotions at our mediation table, Vikram, that can change the mediation. It could actually give it new life, new air, a turn. And it's very important that mediators feel comfortable with that. So there's a lot going on at the mediation table. And when you look at the culture of the United States, we have so much happening that mediation is now becoming everywhere. You've got workplace mediations. You've got special education mediations for special education students in schools. Think about that, Vikram, as a mediator. You form a relationship with a school district, and parents have special education students since kindergarten or first grade. And in the United States, they have an IEP, an individualized education program, that has to be abided by. It's a legal document. So if teachers do a disservice to special education students with special needs in the school, that's a legal issue. So we've got mediators mediating there before it becomes a legal issue as well. We've got mediators, we've got med-arb combinations, mediation before arbitration, which a friend of mine we're talking about maybe doing a little presentation on that, or before you have arbitration or before something goes to court, it gets mediated. So when you think about mediation in the United States, it's really spreading in so many different arenas. Divorce, it's in probate court, it's in civil court, of course, with small claims cases. It's everywhere. And also, it's a very good thing, because really, what is mediation all about? Mediation is sitting down at the table, having a conversation with all the interested parties, and it's the last place that you have 100% control over your life, because you're sitting there with a neutral third party. And I know we all know this, and I'd love to explain it, because it really is the last place where all the parties retain control. And it's the mediator's job to keep the power balance balanced. It's the mediator's job to make sure everyone has a voice. It's the mediator's job to be neutral. We're pledging a lot on the table for our parties. After mediation, somebody steps in and makes a decision about their lives. And that is such the value of mediation. We can try to figure this out before someone else that hasn't lived your life, doesn't know your life, steps in and makes a partial or a complete decision about your life, where we get into possibly winning and losing. In the United States, some people say that a good mediation hurts for both sides, and I don't like that at all. I'm like, no, it doesn't. I always say a good mediation is a win-win, because people learn to understand that all conflict is a thunderclap of differences. That's my favorite quote. Conflict is a thunderclap of differences, and mediation occupies the space in between the conflict. So there's a space there. And if people understand that conflict that comes up against each other, if that's their opportunity to do something new, to do difference, as I like to say, then we're good. People can understand that. So at the mediation table, that's their opportunity to do something different. Maybe people stop doing something. Maybe people start doing something. We all know mediation is about generating options, and the mediation table can do that. And now, hopefully, parties are thinking outside their box of their conflict. They're not so polarized, and they're going ahead and considering options. And they're also seeing with those options, they're also seeing how they can live their life differently. So I see mediation within a culture as a melting pot of the United States as a real opportunity for an individualized experience, to do something different, to move out of the mediation with new hope and faith and love for life, and maybe, an apology or something on the mediation table that shows love and care for the other person. I don't know. It's up to the parties to decide, but there's a lot that can happen. Even with apologies, Vikram, there's about 7 different kinds of apologies that people can utilize at the mediation table. So it's got such a breadth for new opportunities. And I'm so glad that the United States is seeing the benefit of putting mediation in different places. The United States is starting to talk about contractual law, with the unions. Unions love to go, straight to arbitration. Well, now they're considering mediation first. And the workplace as well. I've done a couple workplace issues. And when you think about a mediator coming in and clarifying what's happening, it's saving down the road, it's saving somebody from a lawsuit. It's saving someone from getting sued and someone having to sue, because they're getting their justice on the mediation table. And because mediation has got such broad arms, justice is defined by the parties. And you just never know what justice looks like, because as mediators, we know that people have positions. I don't want him to have the house. That's my position. That's the position. But as mediators, we're trained that behind that position are reasons and interests. And we are trained as mediators to dig into those interests. Hear the position, but then ask the how question, the what question. How is this for you that you don't want to see him have the house? Can you tell me more about that? Can you share more about that? So all these open-ended questions and open-ended statements that we use as mediators, you don't get that experience in arbitration. You don't get that experience in court with a lawyer. Because of course, in arbitration and in court with a lawyer, what's honored is the law, as it should be. So I like to say lawyering is a gladiator sport, and it should be. And mediating is a conductor of the symphony. And the symphony are the voices of the people at the table that we should be hearing, that we should be clarifying. And we are the conductor of the process. And yet again, we have that whole concept of the last place at the table where you can sit down and just hash this out is the mediation process. With restorative justice and restorative practices, which I'm hoping Jillian will join in, as she's been involved with restorative practices for 4 years, and I would like her to explain a little bit about her high school if she's willing. We've taken restorative justice and restorative practices in really interesting ways. We've taken restorative justice as plucking a young person out of the justice system and saying, you know what, we're going to put you in a circle of individuals that have to do with the harm that was caused. And everyone's going to discuss the harm that was caused with you, the person who created harm. And we're going to figure out how to restore everyone back to each other. So that's restorative justice, because the research has found, and I'm not much of a research person, but every once in a while I'll look it up because I'm interested. If you put a young person in prison or jail, they're more likely to return to prison and jail because they get used to it. What I don't hear, what I know as a teacher, as I was a high school teacher, health education for 22 years, young people before age 24, their prefrontal cortex is not mature enough to make really good decisions for themselves. And they also need to bond with somebody, something, somehow, some way, especially teenagers. And what happens, you put young people in jail in the United States and they bond with that whole process. They bond with the interactions they're having there. And all of a sudden now that's what they know best. And so when let out of jail or prison, they'll oftentimes do something to land them back into what was familiar. And there's a lot more to it than that, but that's what restorative justice is doing. So in Massachusetts back in the 70s, they started really looking at this restorative justice and saying, we need to do something. And other states are doing that, where they want to make sure that they delay a young person going into prison or jail by offering the opportunity of restorative practices. Let's see what we can do over here before we sentence. It's before sentencing oftentimes, before we sentence them to go to jail, before we sentence them to go to prison. There was one state I was reading about where the police officers can actually go on the scene in the United States and they can determine if they want to charge and book the people or if they want to refer them to a restorative justice pathway instead of bringing charges. And if that doesn't work, then yes, we'll bring the charges. So that's a nice little option as well with restorative justice. Restorative practices in schools and workplaces and other venues are when people come to the table and have the practice of restoring and vocalizing and clarifying what's bothering them. You see a lot of restorative practices in schools in the United States, starting with elementary schools where you have a talking piece. And when that young person holds on to that talking piece, they have the airwaves. No one else is allowed to talk until they pass it. And everyone speaks about themselves. And I'm hoping that this might be the point where my daughter will be willing to join in and talk, because she's a lot more eloquent and practiced than I am about restorative practices. So thank you, Jillian.
Okay. Thanks, Mom.
But Jillian, this is the point where I interrupt. Now you're also now a speaker in the symposium, so you will have to introduce yourself, and you go as a part of that 75 plus. You are part of that now. So please introduce yourself, not just as Kathleen's daughter, but as Jillian.
Oh, what an honor. Thank you. My name is Jillian Leedy. I was a high school teacher at a school in Flushing, Queens in New York City. It's called an international school where our students are all recent immigrants to the United States from 7th grade up, and they come to our school to learn English as well as to learn restorative justice practices. And I can really only speak for my school because my experience in restorative justice is limited to that, with a little bit of training on the side. What I can say related to what's been talked about here is we try to build that restorative culture within our school. So from 9th grade, even if a kid can't speak English, like they're thrown into, we don't call it a table, we call it a circle. And so everyone's gathered together. There's a question that everyone is choosing to answer. They can also choose to pass, to give people authenticity and to help build that muscle of wanting to take responsibility for answering the question for other people to hear, right? And for themselves to like name out loud. And so from 9th grade on, every week, kids are thrown into circles. We really want them to be comfortable with talking with each other about uncomfortable topics. Diving into ambiguity is huge for us. And doing that with other people by your side, even if you don't know them well, is also huge in learning how to trust build and in learning how to create relationships, especially for my students who are coming to a whole new country. Like, what are they gonna do? And so we don't want or students to just go back to their families for all the answers. We want them to like reach out, join in, and add to the culture of our school, our country, and we release them into the world to be citizens. Or if not citizens, then to take on jobs in society, right? Wherever they choose to go after that. So it's really related to mediation in a lot of ways, especially if there's conflict. So if there's conflict in our school, which does happen, not often because we are engaged in circle practice a lot. So people are used to just talking with each other. We will sit down at the table and it will be kind of a mediator space where the person who caused harm and the person who feels harmed will have like separate sessions to prep them for then an organized circle together where we try to restore what was harmed with each other. And to me, with my talks with Mom, the big difference is that mediation, you want to have this end result, this contract that's signed. Like this thing has to happen, this thing has to happen, this thing happens. Whereas in school, there's no contract, right? We just have trust and we have an ongoing process. So if that doesn't get quote unquote resolved, we do it again. And then we do it again. And then we do it again, right? And so we need each other is what we teach each other to find answers. And those answers are individual for sure. because everyone has their own perspective on life. But we can't grow and we can't learn without each other. And that's kind of how we use restorative justice mediation in school.
In a typical circle, what would be an example of like a couple questions that you would pose to the students that they would want to talk about when they hold the talking piece, right? That's their chance to talk. And then when they give it away, that the next person talks. What would be like an example of some questions you've used as teachers for your students in the circle?
It depends on the circle. It could be something as simple as, how was your day? How are you feeling right now? You know, is there something special you want to share that happened to you this morning or this week? Or it could be something really deep, especially with conflict resolution, where it's like, how do you feel harmed? And this question is posed to the person who caused harm, as well as the person who felt harmed, right? And so we want everyone's perception to be there. And then the person who caused harm, we want people to name, like, what is the harm you caused? Even if you feel like you did the right thing, it's important to name how that thing affected another person. You know, and we just have to be open about that. And so justice looks different to you, it looks different to that person. But together we can figure out, even if you don't think as a student you were wrong, we can figure out how to heal something, how to restore something here together.
And so I see that opportunity at the mediation table as well, in the realm because of clarity. And that's why I'm very keen on clarifying all the three essential narratives, as I call it, the words, the body language, and the emotions. Because with that clarity, even though I'm a facilitative mediator, I'm not a mediator that's into transformative practices. I'm a mediator that wants to clarify, that considers it my job to clarify. And with that clarity, then can come a process and ending like this where people are transformed and they have a new outlook on life and they see things a little bit differently and they can do difference. And that clarity, to me, that is my main thing as a mediator. I use reiteration, clarity all the time. And when I train, I tell my students, reiteration summaries are 100% accurate. And when people, I'm smiling, and when people are under stress, what do you see at the mediation table? People are in shock. What is shock? They are fleeing from something. They are being competitive about something. They are being paralyzed by something. They are fawning all over people by over complimenting them. That's what shock looks like at the mediation table. So because everyone's in shock at the mediation table, everyone's upset, they talk and use the words they can muster. And so I teach reiteration summaries because it's 100% accurate and you get to the clarity. Because what I don't want at the mediation table, especially when you think about culture in mediation, I don't want to use my American girl word when somebody else is using a Hispanic word or a Vietnamese word. I want to reiterate them 100% as best as I possibly can, which means mediators have to memorize at least key words, because I don't want my clients to have to clarify me. They're so busy trying to understand themselves at the mediation table. I want them to clarify themselves. So as people say the words they can muster, under stress, because they are under stress, they're in some form of shock, they're in some form of the grieving process, denial, acceptance, anger. They're somewhere in that realm because they're upset and they have a dispute that hasn't been resolved. So of course they're somewhere in that shock realm. When I reiterate, summarize my parties, they're clarifying themselves. They're not clarifying me. They're clarifying, they say their words, I say their words, and they either say, okay, or they change their words. Oh, Kathleen, I didn't mean that. So because of this clarification process, that if a mediator, I like to say, you hold it, as tight as a brother to their words, having the ability to have transformation at the end of the mediation process. And it's truly beautiful. In court, my parties were hugging each other in front of the judges, and the judges, when they first started, the judges are looking at me like, Kathleen, like, what's happening? Because I had my own judge each day of the week, like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday for a year, I had my own judge. And finally, they just got used to it. But people, because, you know, we are connected to each other, there is a place in a lot of people where they want to resolve issues and they want to be successful in resolving conflicts. And they maybe even want to be reconnected with the person or where the harm was caused, with the situation or the person. So because we're all Homo sapiens, we have this bond that can come out in the mediation process if the mediator will allow it to happen. Because also of the culture of Vikram, I don't lay down ground rules. And when I train, I tell the people, participants, if you want to lay down ground rules, then put them at the feet of the mediation process and say things like, you know, mediation works best when people are respectful. Mediation works best when people try not to interrupt each other. Give the ground rules to the mediation table because of the cultural differences that we have in the United States. Because you also want to direct the pressure, because the question becomes, what happens when the ground rule gets broken? Oh, it's the mediator's ground rule. Uh-oh, now the mediator gets to be the referee and or the judge. And what did a mediator pledge in the beginning of the process? I'm neutral. Oh, well, I'm going to take a little short pause and be your judge and be your referee right now. Then we'll get back to the mediation. No, I don't want that in my mediation. I want mediation to flow because cultures flow and mediation needs movement. What parties, I always say now, based on, you know, my good friend Andrew Miller, because as mediators, we should always be growing. He said something. He said, I tell the parties that the positions that have brought them here today will not resolve this mediation. And now I say that in the beginning of every mediation. And I thanked him for those words. Because if we're not growing as mediators, we're moving backward because life doesn't really hold still for anybody, including mediators. So I say that. And I also say mediation requires movement. I put those principles out there and my parties will say, yeah, Kathleen, I guess we need some movement right now. And I'm like, yeah, we need some movement. If you want this mediation to resolve, you need to move. So what are they moving? How are they moving? They're moving away from their positions, right? Potentially, and toward each other. So there's all these, there's all these circular things that are happening in mediation, which is beautiful for culture. People get to be themselves and say what's on their mind and let the underbelly emotion come up. And then as a mediator, we pull out linear thoughts that we hear because we should be listening for agreements. So this is why I don't want to ever have a ground rule. We won't interrupt each other because I'm going to be the first one to interrupt. If I think my mediation needs to be interrupted, I'm going to jump in the switching pause, which is the word between people's, the pause between people's words. People have to take a breath when they're talking. Well, there's a switching pause. You can interrupt right there. And there's also a switching pause after a sentence. You can interrupt right there. I am going to interrupt. I'm going to say, did I just hear a partial agreement here? And I'm going to pull out those linear partial agreements and put it down so they can continue their true interaction. And sometimes people can be arguing for 2.5 hours. And I'm busy writing down what I've heard them say. What are possible agreements and interrupting, saying, is this a possibility? And they go, yes. And I say, okay, continue. So they continue arguing and I continue being me. And I have found that this style of mediation works very well across cultures, especially the culture of the family, especially their personal culture of conflict, because that's what they're bringing to the table, Vikram. And I think our keynote speaker opened up with that. He said it's very important, and it is very important because no matter their race, no matter their gender, it's that culture of conflict that caused the issue that's at the mediation table, that is foremost at the mediation table. Yeah. And go ahead.
Oh, it reminds me of the talking piece that you're asking me to go more deeply into, because it forces people within the circle to listen to one another. And everyone, when people are bad at circles or they're used to hearing themselves talk, they'll try to interrupt, they'll try to interject, they'll try to do all those things. And so that practice of just passing it around, and even if that person has a completely different political view than you or a completely different concept than you, you're not allowed to say it. You have to just take it in, breathe it in, And then you can say what's important to you when that talking piece gets handed back, when it comes back around. But that listening capacity is super important for people, I think, engaging in mediation, and for like the circle keeper or the mediator to pick up on what's being said.
So in the restorative practices, it's the intelligence of the group that helps people change and grow, because no one can interrupt. In mediation, it's the clarity for the clients that helps them change and grow. Oh, this is what I really want. Oh, this is what I really mean. Oh, because of the reiteration, they get to chew over, like a cow has 3 stomachs, it chews its cud. Well, they get to chew over their words with reiteration summaries. So the United States is alive and well with doing both of these practices, mediation and the restorative justice and the restorative practices. And, people in the United States, when I do a divorce mediation, they say typically how long, maybe I'm doing one in Massachusetts, maybe it's in Washington, maybe it's in Texas. And they say, how long? And I said, well, a divorce in Massachusetts takes about 2 years. It can take as long as 2 years. And they're like, oh my gosh, 2 years. Well, that's a short time compared to other countries, 2 years. And then sometimes in the United States, 6 months, you can have, a divorce happen. So because of all of what we're doing, we're spreading out the load of these, these conflicts, and it's helping people get resolution quicker. So I think that's all of it I might have to say. Do you have anything you want to add?
One more important thing that our school does is it's called circle keepers. It's a group of students who take on being the leader of the circle, and they learn how to the leading process requires that if someone gets interrupted, to make sure that's not happening, that when the talking piece is passed around, everyone gets their moment, or to also re-engage a topic if it feels like full of conflict, or if it feels as if a lot of people are being quiet. But the most important part about that, which kind of relates to what Migla was saying earlier, is how judges are the ones taking on the mediation cases. And it's hard to be there when students are leading a circle as a teacher, because I have my idea of how it should be. And so what I want to ask myself is, how am I giving up my responsibility to others who are actually better at doing the job? Like, my students are way better at leading a circle of students than I ever will be, because they are a part of that culture. They are a part of that world. So how am I empowering them to take on that so that they can be brave to do that in the world?
And with mediation, how are you empowering the parties to step into their new agreement and their new way of doing things? And how do you undergird them? And how do they get confidence in the mediation process to be able to do that? Because when I've heard people walk away from a mediation without an agreement, they say things like, we can't even mediate, right? So there's another loss of confidence. So now life takes another bite out of someone to lower their confidence, to diminish their value as a person, and they just kind of throw their hands up in the air, and now they have to go have someone else make a decision for them because they couldn't even mediate properly according to them. So it's sad. So I want mediation, to be a hope for people, because mediation is about compassion and love and care. Because as a mediator, when you promise neutrality, you suspend your judgment over what you hear. That's hard. We all know that's hard. You're suspending judgment. That's care and compassion. So I think the mediation process has the potential to be a very beautiful process, and to release people into their to their new due difference.
Yeah, and how are we fighting the cultural complex within all of us that wants to bow down to the dictator, right? Like, how do we have a country where we say, okay, we give you the authority, but actually we hate you, and we're going to research everything on our own and not talk to anyone about it, because we need control and we need to know that we're powerful, right? So how do we heal that cultural issue that's inside?
With our fierce American independency, that we very strong individuals, and a lot of competition in the United States. And mediation is not about competition. And I say that this is about cooperation. And so it has the opportunity. When people feel safe enough, they will lay down their weapons. I call it the 50 faces of conflict. They'll lay down their weapons and they'll try to work out something that will harmonize them so they can move forward in a more beautiful way. Thank you. Let's take some questions or comments.
Thank you, Jillian and Kathleen. But first, let me ask Jillian. Jillian, when we're talking about obviously circle and everything, what when we talk about peer mediation, what is happening on peer mediation in schools?
Peer mediation, we've never done that. We've just done circle keeping, which is where the student leads the circle as it goes around. Peer mediation sounds awesome. You know, usually that happens with teachers, but I would love to go to the school right now and be like, hey, we should train people to actually, students to sit in on these mediations. The issue with that becomes privacy. You know, how do we have other students knowing the big conflicts of others if they're not invited into that space? And how can we guarantee that the people who are trained to navigate that space, the peer mediation, want to be invited there by the people who have conflict?
So basically the way mediation works, I mean, otherwise confidential process, they're resolving the dispute. Because look, I mean, there are obviously people who do not like this when I say that, but children themselves are totally trained. They're already doing it. They're already doing mediations within themselves. They know everything. You don't need to tell them anything. They know the process. They're actually doing it very successfully. Because I talk to students all over the world. And when I hear them talk about the process, they can teach people about mediation. So I'm just thinking that if the culture develops there and if it's already there, we just need to promote it. Why isn't that something we should be doing? And what do you see happening on that?
I see it being very difficult for people to give power over to kids, or to give power away, period. Even if we like bravely believe in it. Like, yes, we will give the power to the youth, right? And they're like, oh, but maybe not here. Ooh, but maybe not there either. And that's why I believe in restorative justice, because we have to practice it on ourselves all the time. Be like, oh, how are we impeding the growth of students by not allowing them to do like what you said, what they're naturally doing anyway, because we want to be controlling and the expert, quote unquote, the adults.
Yeah, no, but I think what you're saying in terms of not giving up power, on the other end, even when they become adults, people want to regulate the profession. They want to tell you whom you should go to. The point is, people are already doing it. I mean, children are doing it in the play field. Adults are doing it in every other space without it being maybe called, now I'm doing a formal mediation, but they're already doing it. So I think we maybe somewhere, I think we need to discuss this and rethink that as aspect. But Kathleen, the interesting point, I mean, when I read statistics, when I see the most litigious society, but the society where mediation has been there for 40 years, and you tell the world that, look, we have been doing it. And of course, a lot of people take that whole concept of mediation and the whole concept of mediation all over the world. But why hasn't that culture developed at the grassroots that you don't get 100 million cases filed in courts every year? Where is the issue there? Where is the
United States is a very competitive society, and we're trained to win. Americans like to win. So sitting down and dealing with relationships, which is what mediation forces people to do, or it invites people to do, is the issue. And just like, with India now with your backlog, the United States started mediation because of a backlog in cases. It was the same reason. And it's spreading, and that's good. The old ancient traditions in the East were said originally, if you need someone to help you resolve a conflict, what good are you? They expected people to resolve conflicts on their own in the Eastern cultures, the ancient Eastern cultures. So yeah, it's a mindset. And sometimes with people, like the courts are making mandatory mediations, which is like the buzz thing right now among mediators, across the country. Everyone's talking about, oh my gosh. Well, what the courts are doing is they're mandating an appointment, and they're not calling it by the right word. We, as Americans, mandated? What do you mean? We have to do something? We don't think so. 4th of July all over again, right? So they need to call it something different, because really what it is please sit down and talk at the table before you come to the court, and we have to render a decision about your life that we know nothing about. So they're not calling it the right thing. So everyone's talking about, so what we do now, we split the baby, you know, like Solomon, we said, okay, so the court is mandating an appointment, but since you're here, why don't you go ahead and just mediate? We'll see what we can do. That's what we're trying to get into, to make it, you know, palatable. As far as peer mediation goes, I was involved in that as a teacher in 1992 in a little small high school in Pennsylvania. And what I'm telling people now that want to start peer mediation, there's 3 levels that are very important. Are your students coming in to talk to you for clarity and for a sounding board? Are they coming in to talk to a peer mediator about options? And or are they coming in to talk to a peer mediator about an action that they want to do? It's very important to take the 3 of them step by step by step, because what happens if that isn't part of the process, peer mediation goes into, oh, okay, so what do you want to do about it? And that's not what's important. And when I was speaking in Nigeria a couple of weeks ago, I was telling these high school students, you want to be able to have mediation skills. You're growing. You don't want conflict to occupy your life so you don't even know who you are. By the time you get out of high school, you don't know who you are because you've been busy fighting with everyone, fighting with the teachers, fighting with your parents, fighting with your friends. No, you want to be able to start to understand what you were birthed for, who you are, your identity, not be in conflict all the time. So that's the beauty of peer mediation in the schools, but it has to be made very clear, what is your purpose for being here? Because if a kid's coming in just to, because they want to talk to somebody, then that's what they want, and that's what should happen. No options generated or action points generated, just as a sounding board.
But Kathleen, as a teacher, why were you involved in peer mediation? My concept of peer mediation is by the children, of the children, for the children. No one else gets involved. That's the way I look at it. And I think maybe that's where it's going wrong, because then it becomes maybe counseling and other areas it goes into. It is these children sitting together, resolving their disputes, telling them you can do it yourself, and not taking it beyond that at all. So that's the way I look at it. I mean, that's my...
That's where we part ways. We're friends, but we part ways. You know, because of the lack of development of the prefrontal cortex before age 24, it's not even developed to make good decisions. That's why you see teenagers doing all crazy things here in the United States. So children need guidance, but they need the right kind of guidance. They don't need someone to come in and be a dictator. My first day of class as a teacher, I said, we don't live in a dictatorship society. I am not running a dictatorship classroom. This is an American society. This is a democratic society. This classroom will be democratic. And I was in control if I needed to be in control. So it's you're looking for the right kind of guidance, Vikram. I don't think you're looking for no guidance.
Yeah.
and you and I can talk about that all day long, right?
I disagree. I'm always
there you go, Vikram. She's on your side. Oh my
There are
gosh.
lots of people. Jillian, we have to start this other movement where these oldies are out of the whole thing. They're not being able to. These oldies are not wanting to let go. They want to be there somewhere.
The only thing I would say is because kids are still growing and students, like, I think they would need something like maybe videotaping the event or like something to turn back to, where we can be like, that moment, I don't know what I did wrong, or this thing, how can I have guidance here? So, or some kind of safe word or an opt-out, where they can pull in a teacher if needed.
Because I don't know, I mean, look, yeah.
And I can tell you that training is important. Training is really super important. You really learn a lot with the right kind of training and the right kind of guidance, but not this dictatorial kind of guidance. I'm not a fan.
Look, now I can't, because I can't say whether the Western or Eastern culture. I mean, don't want to put it there, but maybe there is somewhere there. I think when I talk to the children, I see that they have everything. They know everything. They know what to do. But the point is, are we telling them that is the way you need to resolve your disputes within yourselves? And the same thing with society. Like I said, over the last 40 years, with mediation being part of the court system and not being able to get out of there, if you are still going to file 100 billion cases a year, that means the culture of mediation permeating society has not happened. That means you still want looking at the courts as a place where or is it a threat? I don't know. I mean, that you'll have to tell us. Is it a threat that I've taken you to court and now let's go sit down on the table? Or is it that we...
Lawyering is a very ancient tradition, and it's well respected, and it's a profession. I mean, go to law school, pass the bar. Mediation is a practice. I mean, 40-hour basic mediation course, you barely know anything when you come out of that. And your mediation is only as good as the mediator, Vikram, at the table, and your training is only as good as your trainer. So it's a practice. So people need to go into the batting cage, I say, of small claims court to practice, to get good at what they're doing. And it's not a profession. So you've got an ancient profession that's revered of lawyering versus this new movement since the 70s of mediation and mediators. Mediation's cheaper because mediators, we don't do discovery. And that's one of the important differences between lawyering and mediating. We don't do discovery. We don't spend money on researching bank accounts and all this kind of stuff. In the United States, they fill out financials and we say, are you telling the truth? And they say yes, and they sign off on it. And then you have to prove that someone's lied on their financials. So it's a much cheaper process in the United States than lawyering. And it usually doesn't take as long as well.
But with these discussions that we're having as part of the symposium, what I have been looking at it is that there is this whole pool of people out there. They have been doing it, they are doing it. And if these are the people who make it their profession, I think maybe things might change faster. But because in 40 years, if people still are not being able to do it within themselves, maybe there is a fundamental issue with the way it's structured. It could be. I mean, it's just a thought. Kathleen, don't have to. We do disagree a lot, so we won't go any further on this. If there's anyone else who wants to come, yeah, Kathleen.
Cancer is conflict. People don't realize how nurturing conflict is. They don't understand the possibilities of conflict. They make it emotional and they make it charged instead of realizing it's the thunderclap of differences. That's what conflict really is. Oh, you and I disagree, Vikram. So let's sit down and talk about it, and let's have a great conversation about it and wonder what's going to come out. People don't do well with conflict, and they don't respect and regard conflict. That's, I think, the initial issue.
I think conflict is good. I mean, if we do not disagree, how does society move forward? Otherwise, we just have a dictator who tells us what to do, and we agree and we move on. Conflict is good. I mean, I really feel that we need conflict, and you can see with me, we always are in conflict in a lot of things. But it doesn't go against what we as people are in terms of relationship. I think we just move forward and we talk about it.
That responsibility belongs to the family because they're the ones that create a culture of conflict in that family of where everyone grows up. It's that culture that gets carried out into the larger culture of society.
And the school, because school is mandatory.
In the school as well.
But I'm seeing that no one has put any question on the table, in the chat. Anyone wants to come in, you know that.
Time in LA. Questions? You might
have. So nice. But first of all, Kathleen, happy birthday. Officially, I haven't done it on record. Happy birthday, Kathleen. And
thank you.
I can see a change in your conduct. You're growing older, it seems.
I am 64, so I'm doing pretty good for 64.
Okay, now let's get Jimena in. Jimena, please.
Talk to us, Jimena.
Yeah, finally I can unmute. Thank you, Vikram. Kathleen, happy birthday. Yeah, it's really nice to be with you today. Jillian, it's really great what you're doing about the circle keeping. It's fascinating to hear what you're doing. And yeah, I have a question for you. It is about how do you empower and give confidence to those students who continuously step out of the conversation and don't want to talk, but continuously, I mean.
Just constant invitation.
Constant invitation.
Yeah, or pulling people aside, doing a one-on-one, be like, I really want to hear you. I miss your voice. You talk in these other ways. Like, please help